Morning, everyone. How are you? A little better, okay. So this past September, the 141-year-old magazine Popular Science made a surprising announcement. They said that they would no longer be permitting readers to post comments on their webpage. The reason, the editors said, was because what they called a fractious minority of posters was filling the site with insults and false or distorted information, turning it into what they called a grotesque reflection of the media culture surrounding us. Studies actually show that when readers of well-researched stories are exposed to a barrage of rude, polarizing, and ad hominem attacks from unqualified individuals, their understanding of the story itself is actually eroded, and they begin to doubt its conclusions, no matter the weight of the actual evidence. So better, Popular Science concluded, to simply shut off these torrents of uncivility, verbal abuse, and misinformation. Sadly, I think many Christian communities now face the same dilemma as the editors of Popular Science. We too have in many ways become a grotesque reflection of our larger culture, with its never-ending parade of no longer talking but shouting heads and polarized discourse. Last evening, I visited an Adventist website that will remain nameless, where I think many members and perhaps even a few church officials now turn for news about what is happening in the Adventist community. Not all, but an alarming number of comments on the website were, as they have been for a very long time, very uncivil, sharply polarizing, and completely anonymous. The issues facing not only Adventists but the larger Christian world are indeed deeply challenging, and they provoke disagreements. They raise fundamental questions about what it means to be a Christ follower in the modern world today. So what is our response as a community of believers to massive and growing levels of economic inequality, or to ecological crises, or to drone warfare, or to the evidence for evolutionary science, or to the battle over gay rights within our larger society, or to the battle over women's ordination inside our own church? Have you ever felt your blood pressure raising, arguing with someone over one of these issues at least? If not, you are a rare breed. We have learned all too well from our culture that in order to win any battle, one must clearly stake out one's camp. And so some of us now say we are liberal Christians, or that we are conservative Christians. And for those of us who are raised in the Adventist tradition, we know that the divisions don't stop there, right? Some of us say we're Adventist Christians, but then we have people say, I follow historic Adventism, or I follow last generation Adventism, or I follow progressive Adventism, or I follow emergent Adventism. Whatever you believe, there is a wing of the church tailor-made for you. And some folks, of course, think that they can stand above it all by saying, we are just mainstream Adventists, right? Others say we're cultural Adventists, and others say, enough with the insanity, I've had it, I'm a former Adventist. Our reading from the lectionary today is therefore, I think, highly contemporary. We understand what is going on in the church in Corinth because, in a deep sense, we too are Corinthians. So let's take a look at the reading. And just a note of correction in your bulletin, it's not verses 1 through 18. We're going to just take a look at verses 10 through 18. So here is what Paul says, writing to the church in Corinth. He says, I appeal to you, brothers and sisters, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that all of you agree with one another in what you say, and that there be no divisions among you, but that you be perfectly united in mind and thought. My brothers and sisters, some from Chloe's household have informed me that there are quarrels among you. What I mean is this. One of you says, I follow Paul. Another, I follow Apollos. Another, I follow Cephas. Still another, I follow Christ. Is Christ divided? Was Paul crucified for you? Were you baptized in the name of Paul? I thank God that I did not baptize any of you except Crispus and Gaius, so none of you can say that you were baptized in my name. Yes, I also baptized the household of Stephanas. Beyond that, I don't remember if I baptized anyone else. For Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel, not with wisdom and eloquence, lest the cross of Christ be emptied of its power. The situation in Corinth is an interesting one. Corinth is an affluent, highly cosmopolitan seaport. And the church in Corinth is a church of growing pluralism, reflecting the broader society around it. There is a dynamic mix of both Jews and Gentiles who are entering this congregation. And the world around this world of believers, N.T. Wright describes as a world of really pervasive pagan values. He says, the worldview of the entire town was dominated by pagan assumptions. The visual appearance of the town was dominated by pagan symbolism, and the normal mindset of the average Corinthian was dominated by pagan ideas, pagan hopes, and pagan motivations, and the normal lifestyle was dominated by pagan practices. So in this context, the question that arises for the Corinthians is, to what extent should Christ's followers be open to the ideas, the beliefs, and the practices of their surrounding culture? Should Christians eat meat that has been offered to pagan idols? Should they embrace the relaxed sexual attitudes of Corinth? What should the role of women be? Now, there are really two options that emerge here, right? So one option is the option of withdrawal, you know? Kind of like create a self-supporting institute out in the wilderness or something. We know this path. The true believers isolate themselves, separate themselves from the church in Corinth. That's one path, one option. The other path is the path of complete assimilation, fully embrace Corinth and all it has to offer without being very critical about what that might mean for Christ's followers. Now, the result is the church in Corinth is completely divided. There are factions, there are schisms, there are parties, there are camps. Different people claiming to know the right way forward. And Paul begins his response, or in this letter, he begins by making an appeal. And when I read this closely, the thought came to me, okay, there are only really two possibilities here. Either Paul is being naive, and this is a logical absurdity, or he's setting us up for some kind of power play. What I mean is this. Paul says that he appeals to the church in Corinth, saying that all of them should agree with one another in what they say, that there be no divisions among them. How is that possible? How is that possible for them to all agree with each other, right? Someone has to be right and someone has to be wrong. You know, I think it reminded me a little bit of the scene from the play Fiddler on the Roof. Do you remember the scene where Perchik and Mortka have been having this kind of argument, and Tevye says to one, "You're right," and then he says to the other, "And you're right." And then Avram, another villager, chimes in and says, he's right, they can't both be right. And Tevye says, "You're also right." I mean, is Paul really that naive here to say, you know, just all get along, you should all be in agreement with each other? Doesn't he really have only one option? Line up with a camp, get behind a party. Come on, Paul, throw your hat into the ring, use your apostolic authority to sway the debate. Isn't that what we would want Paul to do if he were here today with us? Wouldn't we want him to weigh in on our contentious debates and settle the issue once and for all? At least we would want him to do that if we assumed he was on our side, right? Paul does enter the fray. However, his response challenges many of our assumptions about how one should go about winning. Paul certainly can offer fierce polemical arguments in his letters at times. He seems to be a kind of combative soul. But at least in this particular passage that we're looking at, we find him doing some very interesting and subversive things that might help us to move forward in our own highly polarized communities and culture. So let me offer a few observations here on Paul's mode of conflict resolution. First of all, Paul says that he has been tipped off by Chloe's household. It's because of Chloe's household that he knows that all is not well in Corinth and that it's full of quarrels. Chloe is obviously a female name, and so the head of a household and someone who Paul puts his trust in as a source of true information is a woman, and it seems she's standing above the fray of this male-dominated world of fractious disputes. Now, there's a valuable lesson here I think we can learn from Paul's approach. He is disarmingly transparent. He names his source. If anyone has issue with the church's dirty laundry being leaked out, they can now take it up directly with Chloe and her family, right? No anonymous trolling or spam botting here. But while Paul does name Chloe as his source, it is striking that he does not single out any individual, any particular individual in the church for criticism. Instead, he addresses his words to any and all who might self-identify as being part of 4 general camps or factions. This is the exact opposite of what our culture does, where we name and shame people from behind a veil of anonymity, right? Paul is doing the opposite. He exposes himself and Chloe to criticism without exposing the people who he's going to criticize to direct personal attack. So here are the 4 camps that Paul gives us. The first camp, somewhat amazingly, is the Paul camp. There's a group apparently in Corinth that claims that they are the ones who are following Paul himself. But Paul wants nothing of it. He asks them, he says, "Was I crucified for you? Were you baptized in my name?" He then goes even further. We might paraphrase his reply as follows. "Not only am I glad that none of you were baptized in my name, I'm glad that I didn't baptize any of you at all." And then he kind of, in a fit of absent-mindedness, says, "Well, maybe I did. I don't even remember." Right? Not very flattering if someone in the church was baptized by him. He can't even remember. In any case, the point is clear, Don't appeal to me as a way of puffing yourself up. Paul has no interest in turning himself into some kind of celebrity minister with a devoted flock of followers. I don't get the sense that Paul was the kind of guy who would have had a Twitter account, like he was some kind of hip, media-savvy youth pastor, who was, chalking up followers. I mean, maybe he would have done that. I don't know. I just don't read Paul that way. Paul does have strong views, and he does oftentimes, insert himself into contentious debates. This is a guy, after all, who was a former zealot and Pharisee who persecuted Christians. But Paul is no narcissist. He's not absorbed with his own celebrity or his own ego. All right, what about the second camp? Some people are Paul followers. Then we find another group that are calling themselves apparently Apollos followers. So what is this Apollos camp all about? Well, Apollos, from the book of Acts we know, was a convert to Christianity, a Jew from the city of Alexandria. And when Apollos arrived in the city of Ephesus as this new convert, like many converts, he was all fired up, or as the text reads, fervent in the spirit. And a couple of more mature believers apparently pulled him aside and tried to teach him, they did teach him some of the deeper, theology. It was a couple, actually, Priscilla and Aquila, in Acts chapter 18. Now, maybe Apollos was someone we could call a liberal, if we want to use kind of anachronistic terms to talk about the early Christians. Why do I say that? Well, hailing from the city of Alexandria, Alexandria at the time was dominated by the thoughts of a Jewish philosopher by the name of Philo. Philo was a Hellenizer. He was a syncretist. He was combining Greek and Jewish philosophy and theology, essentially. And so, sometimes geography can tell us something about a person's, where a person is coming from. For example, if you say, he is a Vermont politician versus he is a Texan politician. immediately something comes to mind. You know, what kind of person is this, right? By their geographical point of departure. Or maybe in the Adventist context, someone saying, she's a Southern California Adventist means something very different from she's a Southern University Adventist, right? In any case, we know that Paul has a great deal of respect for Apollos, because in chapter 16 of this letter to Corinth, he says that he strongly urged Apollos to visit the church in Corinth. However, Apollos refused to make the trip. So maybe Apollos was just as disgusted as Paul at the way the Corinthians were behaving and said, I don't want anything to deal with that. I'm not going. We don't know. A lot to speculate about here. But in any case, there's another camp. The third camp that Paul names in this letter is the Cephas camp. And Cephas is another name for Peter. So this camp, the Cephas or Peter camp, if it's the same Cephas described in the book of Galatians in chapter 2, we learn that Paul actually had a fierce conflict with Cephas. Do you remember this? Those of you who know your New Testaments well. In that book, in Galatians, Paul actually says, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. Why did Paul use such strong language in that other letter? Cephas, it seems, is someone who we might call, again, using kind of anachronistic terms, we might think of Cephas as being a conservative. Why is that? Well, Cephas, or Peter, had broken off ties with Gentile Christians because he was lining himself up with what was called the circumcision group. I don't know if I would want to be part of the circumcision group under any circumstances, but these are essentially Jewish Christians, because remember, the early church was, first of all, Jewish. And the big debate in the early church was, can non-Jews become Christians? Can individuals who are not circumcised become Christians? And so Cephas was at some point here aligning himself with these kind of conservative gatekeepers of the faith, we might say, who were forcing Gentiles to follow Jewish customs in order to become part of the Christian community. Now, given this kind of backstory and history, the kind of tension, or, I don't want to say necessarily bad blood, but definitely tension between Cephas and Paul, given this history, it might have been very tempting for Paul to have simply condemned the Cephas camp in Corinth. But Paul only chastises the Cephas camp after he has already disavowed both the Paul camp and the Apollos camp, right? And it is striking that he treats them all on the exact same plane. There is no subtle, self-serving nudging of Paul and Apollos over Cephas. He's leveling the field, right? And then finally we come to the fourth camp, and this is the most striking one of all. It seems there is even in the church in Corinth a Christ camp. Now, we've encountered this kind of camp before. Those who say that unlike everyone else, they are the true followers of Christ, right? I mean, wouldn't that cut the knot? You follow Peter and Paul and whoever, we follow Christ. Something very smug about that. At times, this kind of spiritual arrogance can even infect entire Christian traditions, as when Adventists come to think of themselves as the remnant that has everything to teach and nothing to learn from other Christians, right? Isn't that just turning ourselves into yet another camp, another faction? We have to be very careful, though, because the critique actually cuts both ways. When we progressive Christians begin to think of others as nothing else than embarrassing fundamentalists or something like that, we too become just another Christ camp, don't we? But in response to all of this, Paul says, quite simply, is Christ divided? And he goes on, Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel, not with wisdom and eloquence, lest the cross of Christ be emptied of its power. That is an interesting tension or contradiction that Paul has set up for us here. eloquence and wisdom on the one side versus the power of Christ on the other. It seems that the idea Paul is trying to get across here is that the truthfulness of the Christian gospel, or the good news, is not the truthfulness of a kind of abstract theological or philosophical discourse, something that you can use to browbeat people by showing that you're right and they're wrong in this kind of way that the Christians in Corinth are doing. Rather, the power of the cross is its transformative power. It is not the power of power plays, but the power of reconciliation. It is the power of community restored. So simply by the fact that community is broken, that community is not restored, that there are these divisions within the church, we know that there's something deeply unhealthy going on here, and Christ is not present in that process. The theology that's infusing and informing Paul's writing here is the same one that we find in the book of Galatians, in which Paul makes this powerful statement that all of you, I'm sure, have heard before. He says, "In Christ Jesus, you are all children of God through faith. For all of you who were baptized into Christ have clothed yourself with Christ. There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male nor female, for you are all one in Christ." That is the Christian vision, something that radically transcends and breaks down every kind of barrier you can imagine. And it's one of the things that I most appreciate about this community here at Hollywood. I look out on the congregation and it's astounding the diversity that you'll see around you. How many places in American culture today can you go and see the kind of diverse communities and people that we see reflected here? At the same time, we obviously still have work to do and a ways to go, right? We can't exempt ourselves from the Corinthian situation. We continue to have disputes and divisions, and the power of the gospel is the power that breaks down these divisions, and that's also the work, I think, of the gospel. The work of overcoming differences, which is difficult and dangerous and uncomfortable and frankly exhausting at times, right? We know what that's about, but that's what we're here for. That's what it is about. We don't do that to get somewhere else. That is why we're here, breaking down those walls. So we are now going to move into communion. And Bill, are you going to say a few words about this? This is a tradition that goes all the way back to Christ and his example, and I think illustrates exactly what we're talking about.